Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a shovel well, a metaphorical legal shovel, to some pretty old ground.
Indeed. We're going beneath the surface of classical civilization.
Right, to look at something really quite remarkable. The law of the dead.
It might sound a bit grim, perhaps, but this topic, it really reveals the absolute core of ancient legal and religious thinking.
Yeah, because for us today, how we treat the deceased is mostly personal, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe a public health thing, local rule.
Exactly. But in ancient Greece and Rome, the proper handling of funerals, burials, the sanctity of tombs, this wasn't just social custom. It wasn't just religious rite either.
No.
Our sources are clear. This was treated as a sacred and a legal duty.
And that dual nature, that's what makes this deep dive so necessary, I think. The law literally reached beyond the living citizen into those silent cities where the dead were laid to rest. So we're diving into a whole stack of materials today. Roman legal ideas about property, piety, Greek tragedies, philosophy.
All sorts of things.
And they all seem to reinforce this idea.
Yeah.
Messing with a tomb wasn't just, stealing grave goods. It was a serious act of impiety, a crime against the gods, the ancestors, and the state.
Precisely. So our mission today is really to understand why. Why did the classical world give the deceased such a profound legal status?
Right.
We're digging in to reveal how this whole legal framework had to account for, well, both human society and what one of our key sources calls the divine citizens.
The divine citizens, meaning the ancestral spirit.
Yes, the ancestral spirits. And crucially, the state, the authorities, took on the entire responsibility for adjusting the relations between the living human citizens and these divine ones.
Okay.
This wasn't just a private family affair. This was seen as fundamental to state security.
Okay, let's unpack that then. If the state is managing this relationship between the living and the dead, where do we start? We need the foundation first. Before specific rules about burial plots or funeral costs, what was the basic legal unit driving all these strict regulations?
We have to grasp a really fundamental difference between ancient law and our modern ideas. It's something classical jurists themselves recognized.
Yeah.
Ancient law, especially in its, let's say, primitive state, wasn't primarily concerned with individuals, not in the way we think of them, independent people with personal rights. It was explicitly concerned with families or groups, the gens in Roman terms. The idea of the fully autonomous individual, that was largely, well, foreign to archaic society.
So if the family, the gens, is the main legal player, what did that actually mean for an individual person back then while they were alive? Did they have rights like we'd recognize? Or were they just sort of cogs in this bigger, older machine?
Pretty much cogs in an eternal mechanism, yes. Their role was serving the continuity of that legal entity, the family.
Right.
The legal life of a citizen wasn't seen as starting at birth and ending at death. No, it was explicitly understood as just a continuation of the existence of their forefathers. An existence that would then be prolonged through them and then through their descendants. Think about the Roman paterfamilias.
The head of the household.
Exactly. He held immense legal power, patria potestas, over the living members of his family. Absolute power, really. But even that power wasn't truly personal. It was ultimately exercised on behalf of the lineage, the family line stretching backwards and forwards through time.
Okay, so the family unit is like legally eternal by definition. The dead aren't just memories, they're still part of the legal entity.
Yes.
Which means neglecting the proper funeral rites isn't just disrespectful, it's like actively damaging the family's legal status. It's self-sabotage.
Precisely. Neglecting the dead, failing to perform the rites, failing to ensure the ancestors' peace, that was seen as cutting off the lifeblood, the continuity of the living legal entity itself.
That's huge.
It risked spiritual pollution, sure, but also legal collapse. It jeopardized the family's identity, its ability to hold property, its name, everything. This profound respect, this legal requirement for the continuous existence of the ancestors, that's the engine driving all these burial laws we're looking at.
That really does raise the stakes way beyond just, property squabbles or something.
Yeah.
You're not just being callous about a corpse. You're actively endangering the entire legal and spiritual structure of your own family line.
And this takes us straight into how the Romans specifically dealt with this ongoing spiritual presence. Legally.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting for me. The Roman legal framework had to kind of formalize this presence, didn't it?
Yeah.
They did that by accounting for the spirits of the dead, the manes.
Yes, the manes. The Romans thought of these departed souls as the good spirits. The word manes might even derive from manus, meaning good. They continued to exist as shades. Legally and spiritually, they were often referred to as the dei inferi, the gods below. And crucially, they were believed to haunt the specific spot where the body was buried.
Okay, so tied to the physical location.
Absolutely tied to it. And they expected to receive offerings, meat, drink, ongoing honors from their living relatives. But the key point for law, for jurisprudence, is their location. They dwell permanently in the depths beneath the earth, tied to that burial spot.
So the spiritual reality dictates the legal status of the land itself. Because the mains are there, the ground has to be treated differently by the law.
Absolutely. And what's really critical for understanding Roman governance and thinking is that Roman belief held there was no bridge, no connection, leading from this lower world of the de inferi up to the gods above, the Olympian de superi.
Ah, right. They were separate categories, the gods below, the gods above.
Distinct, separate, gods of the underworld.
Which is a fascinating contrast, isn't it, with Greek myths, where you have heroes like Heracles ascending to Olympus, or even Romulus supposedly becoming the god Quirinus.
Yes. And our source material specifically flags that Romulus becoming Quirinus legend as, and I quote, a thoroughly un-Roman transformation.
That's telling.
It is. And it's a key cultural difference. For the Romans, that kind of upward mobility for the dead was, well, legally and culturally dangerous. The whole system relied on that separation.
How so?
Well, if the mains could just ascend and become Olympian gods, they'd stop being tied to the gravesite, right?
Okay, yeah.
And then the whole legal and religious structure that protected the tombs, the sanctity of the family lineage tied to that spot, it would just collapse. The mains had to stay down below, legally tied to the earth, to enforce that archaic law of family continuity.
Wow. Okay. And the Roman state didn't just, passively accept this spiritual setup. They actively managed the boundary.
Oh, they actively managed it. Through the calendar, primarily. The state formalized this whole spiritual reality by recognizing specific days, dies religiosa.
Religious days.
More like days of uncomfortable feeling. Days when the mundus, which was this symbolic pit or opening to the underworld kept in Rome, was officially considered open.
Open? To let things out.
Specifically, yes, to allow the mains to come up from their shadowy home below the earth. It was a controlled, temporary breach of that boundary.
So the line between the living city and the ancestral spirits wasn't just passively respected, it was actively managed by the state calendar. The state wasn't just managing how citizens treated the dead, it was providing a state-sanctioned window for those divine citizens to interact, however briefly, with the world above.
That's a good way to put it. State-managed interaction.
Okay, so if the state is taking responsibility for managing this whole relationship between the living and the divine citizens, it makes sense then that the state would have to control the rituals involved, the expense of those rituals, maybe. And definitely the physical space where they happen.
Precisely. It had to regulate all of it.
Let's start with controlling the ritual itself. The word religio comes up here, doesn't it? And it seems to mean something much more practical than just religion as we think of it.
Absolutely. For the Romans, religio evolved to mean the fulfillment of ritualistic obligation, the actual performance, the cultus. It became just as much about doing the rites correctly as it was about the underlying feeling of awe or anxiety that might have originally inspired them.
So it's about correct procedure.
Very much so. And this was a point of deep civic pride. Cicero famously declared that Romans were superior to other peoples precisely in religio id est cultu. In religious observance, meaning in the formal execution of ritual.
Right.
The state managed cultus because correct ritual was seen as essential for maintaining the pax deorum, the peace with the gods, and thus ensuring social stability.
Okay, so if the state is managing cultus, this formal ritual obligation, then it stands to reason they'd have laws about funerals. And we know Roman law often focused on controlling two things vital for social order and family stability: where things happen and how much they cost, location and excess.
Exactly. And the control of location for burials is absolutely fundamental in Roman law. The standard rule, codified very early on, even in the archaic law of the 12 Tables, was that bodies had to be buried outside the city's sacred boundary, the pomerium.
Always outside the pomerium. Why was that so non-negotiable? Was it just, sanitation, public health? Or was it mainly religious?
It was primarily about ritual purity and maintaining that strict separation between worlds we just discussed.
Oh.
The pomerium marked the sacred ground of the city proper, governed by fast divine law, and it had to be kept free from pollution, from nephas. The presence of the dead, the Dean Ferry, and everything associated with them was inherently polluting in a ritual sense.
So burying someone inside the city limits would contaminate the whole community.
Ritually, yes. It would upset the balance with the Olympian gods, the desuperi, and make proper civic life, religious ceremonies, state functions impossible. By mandating burial outside the pomerium, the state ensured the living legal community remained ritually clean and distinctly separate from the haunting manes.
So those grand tombs we see lining the Appian Way, marching out from Rome, they weren't just rich families showing off. They were physical markers of this legal boundary. This is where the living city stops and the ancestral city begins.
That's exactly right. And that location outside the main city is also relevant when we talk about the second big legal concern: controlling excess, lavish spending.
Right. The Romans seemed really wary of that, didn't they? Not just because it might seem vulgar, but because it could actually threaten the family line.
Yes, it threatened the legal continuity of the gens. Reckless spending could bankrupt the family, undermining the very entity the rituals were meant to perpetuate.
And we see thinkers like Cicero warning about this kind of thing.
We do. Now, we don't have every single archaic funerary law text in front of us, but the philosophical and social anxiety about financial imprudence is crystal clear. Cicero, remember, he was a lawyer too, not just a philosopher. He warned explicitly against people who drain their patrimony with reckless lavishment and then, having spent everything, follow up largesse with rapine. Basically, spendthrifts turning to crime.
All right.
The Roman elite generally valued moderation. Cicero argued that one's estate, one's wealth must not be so accessible that it is open to all. A due limit ought to be employed. Moderation was key.
But how did the law enforce that moderation? It's one thing for Cicero to write about it, but how did the state actually step in and stop a grieving family from, say, putting on a ruinously expensive funeral show?
Well, this is where we can infer the legal mechanisms, often found in what we call sumptuary laws, laws regulating expenditure. Early Roman laws definitely targeted specific elements of the funeral that could get out of hand financially.
Like what?
For instance, they restricted the amount of gold that could be buried with the deceased. Just a few simple items, maybe teeth fillings, but no massive treasure hoards. They also regulated the funeral procession itself, capping the number of musicians, like flute players, and the number of hired professional mourners to prevent excessive, costly displays.
Ah, hired mourners. So they were policing public grief.
In a way, yes. They were policing the cost and the scale of the public display of grief. The laws targeted those highly visible, often dramatic, and certainly expensive expressions, things like professional wailing women, or excessively long periods of public mourning that disrupted normal life and cost the family money.
I see.
So, by moderating the expense and also the duration of the funeral rites, the law achieved two goals. It ensured the cultus, the ritual obligation to the dead, was fulfilled, but it did so without letting the family bankrupt itself and jeopardize the financial health of the lineage they were supposed to be continuing.
So perform the ritual, but keep it sensible to ensure the family unit survives for the future.
Exactly. The ritual must happen, but the expense must be moderate enough for the eternal family to actually remain eternal.
And presumably, if someone failed this, either by being way too lavish or maybe the opposite, failing to provide any proper burial, the state or the legal system would have grounds to intervene.
They absolutely had to, because the burial space itself was legally protected. Its sanctity was backed by a specific legal status.
How so?
Well, remember, the manes haunt their resting place. Because of that, the place itself takes on a profound religious character. In Roman law, it gets categorized as locus religiosus, a religious place.
Okay.
And crucially, that makes the tomb itself, religiosa, a religious thing.
And what does that mean legally? What's the implication of being a religious thing?
The defining legal characteristic is that it becomes inalienable. It can't be owned in the normal sense. It can't be bought, sold, mortgaged, or treated like regular private property, res privata.
So it's taken out of normal commerce.
Completely. It's perpetually dedicated to the inferiors, the gods below. And the law treated any interference with it with special severity. This is why violating a tomb wasn't just treated as furtum, ordinary theft.
Right.
It was a specific, much more serious crime, often carrying capital punishment. Sepulchri violatio. Violation of a sepulcher.
That distinction is vital, isn't it? Sepulchri violatio.
Okay.
It tells us the law saw the deceased, those divine citizens, as the actual victims of a crime against piety, not just as passive property owners whose stuff got stolen.
Precisely. And we see parallels elsewhere in Roman law where the state sets aside specific, consecrated, inviolable public spaces that weren't quite civic, weren't quite private, like the asylum on the Capitoline Hill, dedicated to a rather obscure evil god, Vidiobus.
Okay.
This Roman habit of legally defining and protecting sacred spaces applied directly to the ancestor's tomb. It demanded special protection against theft, damage, or any kind of unauthorized use.
Okay, that Roman focus on state-managed ritual propriety, keeping the lineage financially stable. It provides a really strong contrast with what we see in Greek law, doesn't it?
It does.
If Rome emphasized cultus and controlling excess, Greek law and thought, especially Athenian thought, seems much more tangled up in these terrifying family obligations related to homicide and getting proper closure for the dead, the vengeance cycle.
Yes, the Greek context often feels far more dramatic, more personal, perhaps. It's often characterized by that cycle of vengeance, which the formal legal system then gradually tried to contain and channel.
Right.
We see this explored so vividly in Greek tragedy. Think of Aeschylus's Oresteia, the killing of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra.
Yeah.
It's explicitly framed as vengeance, right? A consequence of earlier familial horrors, Agamemnon sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. It demands a blood payment.
And Clytemnestra actually says something like, she hopes that by doing this, the thrice-gorged demon of the family can finally be appeased. She sees her act as potentially ending the cycle.
Exactly. She hopes her act will be the final payment, the telos.
Yeah.
But of course, the very nature of vengeance means one act just generates the need for the next.
Yeah. Enter Orestes.
Enter Orestes. He returns, and he's driven not just by personal grief for his father, but by a powerful, explicit command from a god Apollo to exact vengeance.
Right.
Which immediately forces him into this impossible, tragic double bind. To obey the god and avenge his father, he has to kill his own mother.
It's horrific.
The logic presented is stark, brutal. To punish wrong leads to doing wrong. But equally, not to punish wrong is also doing wrong. There's no clean way out. The payment, the telos or consummation of justice, always seems to demand a new act of pollution, especially within the family.
That terrifying cycle, which clearly existed long before Athens had its formal law courts. It must have profoundly shaped how Athenian law eventually approached death and the family's right or duty to pursue justice for homicide.
Absolutely. It meant that the victim's family, the kin group, remained absolutely central to the whole process of justice when someone was killed. Even in the later, more developed Athenian legal system, the formal lawsuits for homicide, the dikaiphonoi, usually had a strict kin requirement.
Meaning only certain relatives could bring the case.
Yes. Specific relatives, like sons, fathers, brothers, cousins, up to a certain degree, often had the exclusive legal right, and arguably the religious duty, to initiate that formal prosecution. This reflects that ancient principle. The death pollutes the lineage, first and foremost, and the state, second.
But what happened if that kin requirement led to a dead end? Say, the killer wiped out the immediate relatives who could prosecute, or maybe the remaining family was just too afraid, or perhaps even implicated somehow. Did the killer just get away with it, leaving the ghost unavenged and the family line permanently polluted?
That's a great question, and it shows the practical side of Athenian law trying to cope with these impossible situations. If the formal kin requirement for a dikaiphonoi was blocked, if it was a dead end, the system had other tools. Alternative legal procedures could be used, particularly a process called apagogé.
Apagogé, what was that? How was it different from the dikaiphonoi?
Okay, so the dikaiphonoi was the formal, often lengthy homicide trial, heard in specific, very solemn courts, like the Areopagus for intentional killing. And it needed the proper kin to file the suit. Apagogé, on the other hand, was a procedure for summary arrest.
Summary arrest, like grabbing someone off the street?
Pretty much, yes. It allowed any citizen to arrest someone caught red-handed or someone publicly known to be guilty of certain serious crimes, often things like major theft, kidnapping, maybe temple robbery, and it could be used for killers too.
So why use apagogé for a killer if there was a specific homicide court?
It seems it was used in situations where the formal dikaiphonoi route was impossible, perhaps no eligible kin, or the killer was just notoriously dangerous and polluting the city by walking around free. Using apagogé reflected the community's urgent need to stop the pollution and achieve some form of justice, dikai, even if the official family-driven homicide procedures couldn't be followed. It ensured the offense against the gods and the community was addressed, even when the specific kin requirement failed.
So a sort of legal safety valve to deal with the pollution of death when the primary mechanism was broken.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And this need for achieving proper closure, for ensuring honor, it extended beyond just catching individual killers, didn't it? It played a big role in civic life, especially regarding soldiers who died for the city.
That's a really important dimension and another key contrast with Rome. While Roman law seemed more focused on controlling the expense of funerals, Greek civic ideology, particularly in Athens, was intensely focused on the meaning of a death. They used public honors for the dead quite deliberately to reinforce citizen values.
Right.
Now, Greek morality was generally cautious about praising people too much while they were still alive. Plato notes this in the laws. He says a man should, run his course and make a fair ending, and then, after he's dead, then they would praise him with hymns and panegyrics.
Why not praise the living?
Too risky. Things could still go wrong. Someone praised today might disgrace themselves tomorrow. Honoring the living was seen as potentially hubristic, maybe even politically dangerous. Safety lay in praising the completed life.
Okay, so this idea of needing to achieve a fair ending, a good tellus, before you get the public praise, that provides the perfect context for understanding the public burial of war heroes, like the ones who died for Athens.
Exactly. When the city gave a fallen soldier a public burial, and especially through that famous Athenian tradition of the annual funeral oration, the epitaphios logos.
Like Pericles' famous speech.
Precisely. The city, through that ritual and that speech, was officially endorsing their lives. It was declaring that these men had achieved the ideal fair ending, the noble telos. It was a powerful mechanism of state control, really, transforming private grief into a shared civic narrative about virtue and sacrifice.
So the funeral oration wasn't just a nice eulogy for the families. It was a political act, a legal statement almost.
Absolutely. It served to manage the collective memory of the dead. It emphasized collective achievement over individual loss, stressed military courage, the glory of dying for the city. And this was crucial because the opposite cowardice wasn't just seen as a personal failing. It was a major social and legal worry in Athens.
Really? Legally?
Oh, yes. Military courage, fulfilling your duty, avoiding cowardice. These were fundamental obligations of citizenship. There were numerous legal actions, graphi, that could be brought against citizens accused of draft evasion, astratia, desertion, lepitaction, or even just cowardice in battle, delia.
Wow.
So the state loudly celebrated those who died bravely, in part to create a stark contrast, to highlight the honor they received versus the shame and legal penalties reserved for those deemed cowards or shirkers.
So the Law of the Dead in Athens wasn't just about how you were buried, but about whether your death would be celebrated and enshrined in the city's official memory. It helped define the very standard of good citizenship.
Absolutely did.
Okay, so we've established this incredibly deep connection, law, religion, ancestor duty, all woven together, managed through state ritual control in Rome or focused through civic honor and vengeance cycles in Greece. But, the classical world didn't stand still. Philosophy developed, skepticism arose. How did this whole system, this profound belief structure around the dead, actually hold up over time?
That's the really fascinating question, isn't it? Because you're right, even with these elaborate rituals and deep-seated beliefs, we definitely see skepticism creeping in, particularly in the Greek world.
Yeah.
Our sources mention, for example, that professional soothsayers, people who claim to interpret the god's will, were held in very little honor during the Peloponnesian War. Thucydides makes comments like that. There seems to have been a growing, maybe weary, skepticism about whether you really could keep the gods happy or predict their actions, especially when faced with the seemingly random suffering of war and plague.
So people started doubting the supernatural machinery behind it all.
It seems so, at least among some. People might start wondering, were the manes really coming up from that pit, the mundus, on those specific days? Were the gods really demanding Orestes kill his mother? But, and this is the extraordinary thing, the paradox, that growing skepticism about the efficacy or the literal truth of the rituals didn't seem to fundamentally dismantle the structure of the law itself.
Wait, really? So even if a Roman citizen privately thought, I'm not sure about these Dee and Ferry, the law still demanded they perform the burial rites correctly and protected the tomb.
Precisely. The legal framework proved incredibly stubborn, incredibly resilient. Why? Because it wasn't just about personal belief. It was fundamentally tied to property rights, inheritance, social order, family identity, things that remained crucial regardless of individual theology.
Oh, okay.
Take Roman law. It was constantly changing, constantly being revised and interpreted by jurists over centuries. It was, as one scholar puts it, a moving target. But the most archaic institutions, especially that core concept of the eternal family unit taking precedence over the independent individual, that left deep, long-lasting traces on Roman jurisprudence right through its history.
This sounds like the kind of insight that legal historians like Sir Henry Maine highlighted, right? That modern legal systems are often built on these very old, almost hidden archaic foundations.
It is exactly that kind of insight. The whole basis of Roman citizenship, property law, inheritance, it was constructed on that archaic premise that the paterfamilias legally was the embodiment of the gens, past, present, and future. So even centuries later, when Roman society looked very different, jurists like Gaius or Ulpian were still grappling with legal concepts like patria potestas or the rules around wills and succession that were fundamentally rooted in that ancestor-centric worldview.
So the law just kept operating on that old framework.
Yes. It still treated the family as the primary enduring unit. It still demanded certain behaviors regarding burial, respecting ancestral property, maintaining the lineage, largely irrespective of whether the individual performing those duties genuinely believed the Dee and Fairy were watching.
So, performing the funeral correctly, respecting the tomb, these became, in effect, deeply conservative legal mechanisms, ways of ensuring social stability and legal order continued into the future by anchoring them in the past.
Yes, exactly. They cemented the identity of the family, and by extension the state, through its relationship with its ancestors. They clearly defined the boundaries of belonging, of citizenship. They showed just how far legal and moral duty stretched beyond the lifespan of a living individual. It was all about ensuring the proper transmission of lineage, property, status, and, crucially, honor across generations.
So these ancient laws, they weren't just about, keeping cemeteries tidy or making sure wills were executed. They were defining the very fabric of the community.
They were defining the perpetuation and the safety of the collective group, the family, the clan, the city-state. They did this by legally regulating the relationship between the living, the past, and the spirit world, however literally that was conceived at any given time.
The law of the dead, then, really shows us that the primary concern of ancient law wasn't individual rights as we prioritize them today. It was about the collective, the safety, the continuity, the honor of the group, the lineage.
Absolutely. The dead weren't truly gone from the legal landscape at all. They remained, in a sense, those divine citizens whose peace and status were legislated for and enforced by the living state.
And the living carried the legal weight of ensuring that peace.
A profound legal weight, yes.
So let's try and pull this all together. We've journeyed from that fundamental legal unit, the eternal family, through the Roman state managing religio and burial location, to the intense Greek focus on diccy, vengeance, and civic honor tied to death. What's the big takeaway here? What does this focus on the law of the dead really tell us?
I think the most profound lesson is about who or what the law is ultimately designed to protect and serve. In antiquity, the law of the dead makes it crystal clear that the community's welfare, its very existence, was seen as depending on the proper, respectful, legally defined inclusion of those who came before. It wasn't about the isolated individual, it was about the chain, the lineage, the collective across time.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over. If our modern society increasingly defines itself by the rights we grant to the living individual, what would our world, our legal system, look like today if the state formally recognized and legislated for our ancestors? What if the family, not the individual, remained the unbreakable legal unit across generations? What if violating a duty to your lineage, disrespecting that continuity, carried the same kind of legal weight as, say, a major crime against the living state? Would we think differently about maybe Cicero's warning, about draining our patrimony with reckless lavishment? Would our sense of individual rights feel different if weighed against the legally recognized demands of the eternal family chain?
That is a provocative thought to end on. What if the dead still had legal standing?
It's something to think about. Until next time on The Deep Dive.